It happened on Christmas Eve. My younger brother and I were heading back home to Minnesota to visit our parents. We both went to college in a neighboring state and made it a tradition to return for the holidays every year. That morning, we left early, before dawn. The sky was just beginning to lighten, promising a clear day. The weather was calm. Even the sun peeked out from behind the clouds, and nothing seemed to foreshadow any trouble. We were driving along the highway, chatting about random things. At first, everything was going smoothly. The car responded perfectly to the steering wheel. The tires hummed softly against the road, and it felt like home was just around the corner. But around midday, the weather took a sudden turn. At first, it started snowing lightly, soft flakes drifting down. Soon, the snow thickened, turning into a full-blown blizzard. The radio, which had been playing music in the background, interrupted to announce a massive accident up ahead. Black ice, poor visibility, and multiple cars piled up. We couldn't continue on the highway. I pulled over to the shoulder and turned on the hazard lights. My brother sat quietly, watching me. I pulled out my phone and opened the navigation app. Ahead of us was a solid red line of gridlock. Scanning the map, I found an alternate route. It would take longer, but there would be fewer cars. We agreed it was the best option and took the exit for the detour. At first, things seemed fine. We crossed into Minnesota. A sign reading, "Welcome to Minnesota," flashed in the headlights. The GPS confidently guided us through deserted roads, surrounded by vast, snow-covered fields. The road was almost empty, save for the wind hurling snow against the car, as if trying to force us to stop. The further we drove, the worse the storm became. Visibility dropped to the point where I could barely see the road ahead. The nearest town on the map was miles away, and a creeping sense of unease began to settle in. I slowed down to a crawl. Going over 10 miles per hour felt reckless. The snow swirled around us, an icy grip tightening on the car. It felt like we were alone in this frozen wasteland. My brother stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the white void beyond the windshield. Meanwhile, my mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. What if we crashed? What if the engine died? What if we got buried in the snow? We could freeze to death out here. There was nothing around us, just endless fields blanketed in snow and the biting, relentless wind. By the time dusk began to fall, I could barely make out the road anymore. The snow kept coming and the white haze grew thicker, the wind howling in an eerie monotone. I was ready to pull over and wait it out when suddenly I saw a faint light in the distance. It shimmered through the storm like a beacon in the chaos. Relief washed over me. If there was light, there had to be people. I steered the car in its direction. Slowly, the light grew brighter, cutting through the swirling snow. We drew closer and a house emerged from the storm. It stood right off the road, like a lone refuge in this icy wilderness. The house was 2 stories tall, old, with sloped roofs and peeling paint on the exterior. But it looked sturdy, as though its walls could withstand any storm. Warm, yellowish light glowed in the windows, almost surreal against the backdrop of the blizzard. In front of the house were 2 cars, already half buried in snow. We stopped in front of the house and turned off the engine. Outside, the storm was still raging, snow clinging to the windows as the wind howled like an enraged beast. The house seemed like salvation, though an odd one. The glowing windows and the 2 cars in front felt almost surreal in the snowy wasteland. I hoped the owner would be kind enough to take us in and not leave us to freeze outside. We struggled to open the car doors. The wind immediately hit us with icy needles, and the snow quickly clung to our clothes. My brother and I hunched against the gusts, making our way toward the porch. Around the corner of the house, the wind eased slightly. It was quieter here, and we paused to catch our breath. I knocked on the door. At first softly, then louder, trying to be heard over the howling wind. We stood there, listening until finally we heard the creak of floorboards. The door cracked open. A man in his 40s stood in the doorway. His face was flushed from the cold, and his clothes, a jacket, hat, and heavy boots, looked like he'd just come in from outside. Strands of sandy-colored hair stuck out from under his hat, and his eyes carried a weary look. "Hey," I said, raising my voice to be heard over the wind. "Sorry to bother you, but we're stuck in this storm. Could you let us in?" The man shook his head. "I just got here myself. I'm not the owner." That caught me off guard. He noticed my surprise and clarified, "I'm John." "I'm Tom, and this is my brother Jake," I introduced us. John stepped aside and motioned for us to enter. We squeezed inside, and the contrast was immediate, silence and cold. The house felt abandoned. There was no welcoming warmth, just air as icy as the outside. "Where are the owners?" I asked, looking around. "No idea. Maybe they left," John said, nodding toward the parked vehicles. "The minivan's probably theirs. My truck's next to it." The house was odd. The living room was spacious but dusty. An old couch with sagging cushions, a couple of armchairs, a coffee table draped with a lace doily. It all looked like it hadn't been touched in ages. The walls were adorned with paintings of landscapes, winter forests, snow-covered mountains. We moved to the kitchen. It was just as empty, save for a mug sitting on the table, as if someone had left in a hurry. John found a coffee maker and started preparing a pot. "It feels off," I said, glancing around. "Being in someone else's house. What if the owners come back?" John shrugged. "If they do, I'll pay them. I don't think they'll mind too much. Better that than freezing to death." His confidence eased my nerves a little. I started making coffee for myself and my brother. The kitchen had a neglected feel to it. Dust-coated furniture, a stovetop with a layer of grime, as though it hadn't been used in weeks. It seemed clear the owners had been gone for some time. John placed his mug on the table. "We need to find a stove or we're going to freeze in here," he said. We agreed. The cold was seeping into our bones, and the house seemed to be getting even colder. We searched through the rooms and eventually found a stove in a side room. It was old, cast iron, but looked functional. Nearby was a basket of firewood. We set to work. John carefully arranged the logs while I struck a match. The wood caught fire, and soon the faint smell of smoke filled the room. The flames grew, bringing a small but welcome warmth. As the stove began to heat up, the house felt a little less hostile. Yet there was still a lingering unease, as if we had intruded where we didn't belong. Everything around us bore traces of the people who once lived there. A couple of forgotten toys in a corner, a half-open book on the coffee table, a jacket hanging on a hook by the door. It all seemed too off, as if the owners had left in a rush and hadn't been back for a long time. The house was slowly beginning to warm up. Heat from the stove spread through the room and gradually seeped into the hallways and other parts of the house. We returned to the kitchen to warm our hands and make another round of coffee. The mugs felt comforting in our fingers, and the quiet of the house started to ease our nerves. But the peace didn't last long. Suddenly there was a loud knock at the door, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the stillness like a knife. "That's definitely not the owner," I said, glancing at John. "Maybe more travelers like us?" my brother suggested. I set my mug down and walked toward the door, with John following closely behind. We opened it cautiously. On the porch stood an elderly couple, a man and a woman bundled tightly in winter coats, their faces weathered and cheeks red from the cold. "Good evening," the man said, his voice trembling, though not just from the cold. It carried the weight of exhaustion. "We're stuck in the storm. We saw the light and thought we'd check. Could we come in and wait out the blizzard?" John and I exchanged a look. "We're just travelers ourselves," John said. "But of course, come in." We stepped aside to let them enter. The woman nodded in gratitude as she struggled to take off her snow-covered boots. "Thank you so much," she said, her voice shaky. "We thought we were going to freeze out there." They settled in the kitchen, still shivering from the cold. We fired up the coffee maker again to make them something warm. While we worked, the elderly couple shared their story. They were driving to visit their children for Christmas when the storm caught them off guard. Their predicament mirrored ours so closely that it made us feel like comrades trapped in the same snowy prison. Once everyone had a warm mug in hand, I shared that my brother and I were headed to see our parents. John added that he was traveling for work but got stuck due to the highway accident. The man, who introduced himself as Henry, sighed deeply. "Seems like fate brought us all together here," he said. We nodded in agreement. The tension in the room began to ease, and conversation flowed more naturally. After a while, the woman, Mary, stood up and said, "We have some treats in the car. I'll fetch them. They might brighten things up a bit." Henry insisted on accompanying her. We watched as they braved the storm, trudging through the snow toward their vehicle. Before long, they returned with a box of pastries. Mary set them on a plate and offered them to everyone. The pastries were a small but much appreciated luxury. The sweet cream melted in our mouths, and the soft dough was a comforting reminder that even in moments like this, life could have its pockets of warmth. We chatted and laughed softly, the storm outside momentarily forgotten. Then, a sound interrupted us. A knock, but not at the door this time. It was muted, muffled, and strangely resonant, as though it came from somewhere inside the house. We froze, glancing at one another. "What was that?" Jake asked, his voice low. "Could it be the owner?" John suggested, though his tone betrayed unease. "Maybe they're asleep upstairs, and we've been making ourselves at home in their house." The thought made us all stiffen with discomfort. John set down his mug and stood. "We should check," he said firmly. "Let's call out. If someone's here, they'll answer." We rose slowly, apprehension thick in the air. John, seeming the most confident, took the lead. He approached the staircase that led to the second floor and called out loudly, "Hello? Is anyone there?" The house answered only with the faint creak of settling wood. We began ascending the staircase, trying to step as quietly as possible. The creak of the wooden steps echoed through the house, unnervingly loud in the silence. No one dared to speak. On the second floor, there were 3 doors. The first room we entered was a bedroom. It looked like a typical bedroom, a bed with a wooden headboard, a small wardrobe in the corner, and a bedside table with an old, tarnished lamp. The bed was unmade, the sheets tangled as if someone had risen in a rush and never returned. A pair of socks lay on the floor as though morning routines had been abruptly interrupted. On the walls hung several photographs, one of which caught our attention immediately. It depicted a family. A man with short hair and a wide smile, a woman with a warm expression, and their young son, about 7 years old. The boy looked happy, holding a toy car in his hands. The photo made me wonder what had happened to them and why they had vanished from this place. Dust coated the shelves in the room, thick enough to suggest the house had been unoccupied for weeks, maybe longer. We carefully exited the room and moved to the second door. It was a child's bedroom. The space was tidy, almost eerily so, but it felt untouched for a long time. A small bed with a light blue blanket stood against the wall. Toys were neatly arranged on the shelves. Cars, soldier figurines, blocks. In one corner, a child-sized table held a set of crayons, one of which had fallen to the floor. Despite the apparent order, there was something unsettling about the room. It felt too sterile, as if someone had purposefully preserved it in perfect condition but had long since ceased to use it. The third room was entirely different. Its windows overlooked the field stretching out beyond the road. The white blur of the blizzard obscured the horizon, but it was clear that this room provided an excellent vantage point. At the center stood an old wooden table, cluttered with strange equipment. On one tripod rested a telescope, aimed toward the field. Beside it lay a radar device and a pair of night vision goggles. It looked as though the occupant had been monitoring the area, not just casually, but with serious intent. "What is this?" John muttered, examining the devices. I didn't reply, staring in silence. The goggles, the radar, the telescope, it all gave me an uneasy feeling. Who had been living here, and why did they need such equipment? Were they watching someone or something? After thoroughly inspecting the room and finding nothing else unusual, John suggested we head back downstairs. We nodded in agreement and descended the staircase, our minds racing with questions about the house and its mysterious occupant. Back on the first floor, though the house had warmed slightly, it still felt cold, both physically and atmospherically. Now that we knew the upstairs was empty, the feeling of abandonment and secrecy lingered stronger than ever. There were 2 doors on the main floor we hadn't explored yet. I felt a growing unease at the thought of what we might find. "Maybe we shouldn't," I muttered. John shrugged and replied calmly, "What if something happened to the owner? This place is isolated. They could be in trouble. Think positive. We might be able to help." Reluctantly, I agreed. We approached the first door, but it was locked. John jiggled the handle a few times, but it didn't budge. "All right, leave it," he said, waving it off. "Let's check the other one." When we opened the second door, we froze in place. The room stunned us with its contents. It was a full arsenal. The walls were lined with racks of weapons, rifles, shotguns, pistols. On the central table lay stacks of ammunition in various calibers, crates marked with military-style labels, and even grenades in large boxes tucked in the corner. John reached toward one of the rifles, but quickly pulled his hand back as if it had burned him. "What the hell is this?" he whispered. "Looks like someone was preparing for a war," Henry muttered, his voice low. I remained silent, a chill running down my spine. Questions swirled in my mind. Who lived here? Why did they need so much firepower? This wasn't just a hobbyist's collection. It felt like the owner was either expecting an attack or planning one themselves. We stood there for several minutes, staring at the strange armory. Finally, we returned to the kitchen, all of us visibly shaken. We sat in silence until Mary broke it. "This isn't normal. Not at all," she said, her voice trembling. John nodded. "Whoever lived here, they weren't an ordinary person." We began discussing what it all might mean when suddenly a knock interrupted us. This time, it wasn't at the front door. The sound was faint but distinct, and it came from inside the house. We froze, listening intently. The sound repeated, louder now, and seemed to be coming from the locked door we had just tried. "It's coming from that room," Jake said quietly. We exchanged nervous glances as tension gripped us. John stood up first. "All right, let's go. If someone's in there, we need to find out." We approached the locked door where the noise was coming from. At first, no one spoke, and then John knocked firmly. "Hello? Is anyone in there? Do you need help?" he called out. Silence. We held our breath, waiting. Then another knock came, louder and more insistent, as if someone or something was trying to get our attention. Henry, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "I used to work as a locksmith. If you want, I can try to open it." We agreed immediately. Henry went out to retrieve his tools from the car and quickly got to work. After a few tense minutes, the lock gave way and the door creaked open. Behind it was a storage room. Shelves were filled with boxes, bags, and old items. Dust hung in the air, undisturbed for years. We stepped inside cautiously, looking around for the source of the sound. John pointed to a corner. There, under those boxes. We approached and carefully moved the boxes aside. Beneath them was a heavy metal door leading downward. It was solid, with a thick lock and a small ventilation grate. "It's a basement," I said, my heart pounding. We stood over the door, staring at it, none of us willing to make the first move. We moved closer to the metal door. The knocking was now unmistakable, muffled but rhythmic. Someone was definitely down there. We exchanged glances, and the anxiety in everyone's eyes was palpable. Jake whispered, "What if it's a maniac? Or worse?" The question hung in the air like a thick fog. No one answered, but the silence spoke volumes. Keeping his composure, John reached for the handle. With a faint creak, the door opened, revealing a dark staircase leading down. Narrow concrete steps, coated with a fine layer of dust, descended into blackness. "We need to find out what's down there," John said, gripping a flashlight he'd grabbed from the kitchen. A lump of fear formed in my throat, but I said nothing. One by one, with John leading, we began our descent. The staircase ended in a long concrete corridor, dimly lit by flickering bulbs that barely clung to life. The walls pressed in close, amplifying the oppressive atmosphere. On either side of us were several doors. We stopped in front of the first one. "Should we check?" John asked. None of us could muster an objection, so we nodded hesitantly. He pushed the door open slowly, and it creaked loudly in the silence. The room beyond was a crude basement space, its walls and ceiling made of rough concrete. But what we saw inside made our blood run cold. Skeletons. Shackled to the walls with rusted chains, their heads slumped forward, their bones bleached white with age. The air was thick with the stench of dampness and decay. The sight was horrifying. These people had died here, left to rot in their chains. Mary gasped audibly from behind us. "Oh my God, what is this place?" "We need to leave. Right now," Henry said, gripping her arm protectively. My knees felt weak, and I wanted to agree with him, but John's face darkened in thought. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. "We need to figure out what happened here." He stepped out of the room and continued down the corridor. Despite the elderly couple's protests, the rest of us followed, though every fiber of my being screamed to turn back. The second door we opened revealed an empty room. Just bare concrete walls and damp air. We were beginning to hope that the first room was some grim anomaly when we reached the third door. As we approached, the knocking returned, louder this time, more insistent. We froze in place. "There's someone in there," Jake whispered, his voice trembling. John stepped forward and pushed the door open. It creaked heavily, revealing a sight that struck us with sheer terror. In the corner of the room, chained to the wall, sat a man. He looked to be in his 30s, his body covered in blood, both fresh and dried. His right arm was missing, replaced by a crude stump wrapped in filthy rags. The other limbs were bound to the wall with rusted chains. He was gaunt, his face pale and hollow, his eyes sunken. But his gaze was the most horrifying part. Wild, feral, filled with raw hatred and unbearable pain. He didn't speak, didn't cry for help. He just stared at us, his chest rising and falling with ragged breaths, like a cornered animal ready to pounce. Mary let out a muffled scream, covering her mouth with her hands. Henry immediately stepped back, his face pale. "Oh my God. Who is this?" I whispered, feeling an icy wave of fear wash over me. "They tortured him," John said, grimly scanning the room. The chains, the blood-stained floor, everything pointed to recent and horrific violence. And not long ago. The man suddenly jerked forward, as far as the chains would allow, trying to speak. A raspy wheeze escaped his throat, but no words came out. John took a cautious step closer. "Hey, can you hear me? We're here to help," he said, his voice calm but firm. The man didn't answer. He just stared, his breathing harsh and uneven. The silence in the room was suffocating, broken only by his labored gasps. None of us knew what to do. Everything about this felt like a nightmare we couldn't wake from. Henry stood up, declaring his intent to fetch tools to free the chained man. His determination was clear, but John extended an arm, stopping him. "Wait," John said, his voice steady but firm. "What if he's chained for a reason?" The suggestion was wild, almost absurd, but it stopped us in our tracks. We exchanged uneasy glances as the chained man continued to breathe heavily, his feral gaze fixed on us. "What do we do now?" Mary whispered, her voice quivering. Before anyone could respond, a shout came from above. A loud, sharp, "Hey!" echoed through the house, making us all jump. "The owner?" Henry said, his voice trembling. "It must be the owner. What's going to happen to us now?" Without a word, we bolted up the stairs, leaving the chained man behind in the basement. Every step on the staircase creaked under our hurried movements, and by the time we reached the first floor, the shouts were louder, this time coming from the front door. "Someone's at the door," John said, gripping his flashlight like a weapon. We approached cautiously and cracked the door open. Standing on the porch was a man in uniform, a police officer. He appeared to be in his 40s, with sharp features and short dark hair. His jacket was dusted with snow, and he held his hat in one hand. He was glancing nervously around the property, but at the sight of us, he exhaled in relief. "Thank God someone's here," he said, quickly introducing himself. "Officer Mark Felton. I got caught in the storm and saw the light. Figured it was best to check in." The elderly couple immediately rushed to him, talking over each other in panicked voices. Mary began to explain what we'd found while Henry added fragmented details. Officer Felton raised his hands to calm them. "All right, slow down, one at a time. What's going on here?" I stepped forward, trying to give a coherent explanation. I described how we ended up at the house, the strange discoveries upstairs, the locked basement, and finally the man we found chained below. The officer's expression grew more serious with every word. "Show me," he said firmly. We led him to the basement door. Mark descended first, telling us to stay back. The sound of his boots echoed faintly as he moved further into the darkness. We waited in silence, every second dragging unbearably. About 10 minutes later, he returned, not alone. Behind him was the chained man, now free but barely able to stand. Mark supported him by the shoulders. His face was ghostly pale, and his torn clothes were stained with dried and fresh blood. We found an old blanket and quickly wrapped it around him before helping him to the couch in the living room. Mark stood nearby, hand resting on his holster. His body language was tense, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting danger. "Who is he?" Henry asked. "He hasn't said anything yet," Mark replied. "But it's clear he's been tortured, recently." The officer tried his radio, then his cell phone, but neither worked. The storm had cut us off entirely from the outside world. "All right," he said, slipping the phone into his pocket. "We'll have to wait out the blizzard here, but I need you all to stay alert. If whoever did this comes back, it could get ugly fast." His words hung heavy in the air as he scanned our faces, assessing how prepared we were for such a possibility. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. None of us could imagine sleeping in this house tonight. As we sat in the dimly lit living room, Mark began to speak. "People sometimes go missing around here," he said. "Not often, but with a troubling regularity." "How?" John asked, frowning. Mark hesitated before continuing. "Their cars are found abandoned on the roadside, locked, keys still inside. But the owners are gone. Sometimes there's blood, sometimes not. We've conducted investigations, but they've always come up empty. No witnesses, no leads." "And this house?" John asked, gesturing to the walls surrounding us. "Has it always been like this? Abandoned?" "Yeah," Mark replied. "No one's lived here for years, and no one suspected anything like this." His words weighed on us, deepening the unease. Before we could process what he'd said, a muffled sound broke the silence. A low, distant thump. "What now?" I thought, dread curling in my stomach. The noise repeated, louder this time, coming from the back of the house. I glanced at the clock. It was almost 11 p.m. "Maybe someone came in through the back door," Jake whispered. Mark immediately stood, drawing his gun. "Stay here." We sat frozen, tension thick in the room. Moments later, heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. From the shadows emerged a man. He was tall, around 6 feet, with a powerful build. His face was partially obscured by a thick beard, and his cold, piercing eyes glinted with anger under heavy brows. In one hand, he held a rifle, pointed downward, but ready to fire at any moment. In the other, he gripped a young woman. She looked wild and feral. Her hands were bound behind her back with rough rope. She wore crude patchwork clothing made of animal pelts, and her tangled, dark hair fell across her face. Her eyes darted around like those of a cornered animal, filled with fear and fury. Mark darted forward, aiming his pistol at the man. His voice was sharp and commanding. "Drop the gun, now!" The man froze, his eyes darting around the room as if trying to piece together how so many people had ended up here. Confusion clouded his face. After a tense few seconds, he slowly placed the rifle on the floor. "Wait, this isn't what it looks like," he began, his tone pleading. "I'll decide that," Mark snapped. "Step away from the girl. Now." Reluctantly, the man backed away, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. The girl, still bound and wide-eyed, glanced at us in stunned silence, her gaze flitting nervously between the strangers surrounding her. Mark gestured for the man to move toward the living room, and we trailed behind at a cautious distance. The moment the man entered the room, he froze. His eyes locked onto the previously chained prisoner, now sitting on the couch under a blanket. His face twisted into an unsettling mix of rage and despair. "Why did you release him?" the man growled, his voice tight with anger. "You've made a terrible mistake." "You're in no position to make judgments," Mark shot back, stepping closer with cuffs in hand. Before Mark could restrain him, something unexpected happened. The girl, who had been silent until now, suddenly lunged forward. Her gaze locked onto the once chained man, and a low, guttural growl escaped her throat. The sound was unnatural, almost inhuman. We froze, staring in disbelief as the chained man met her eyes and let out a growl of his own. feral, guttural, and utterly terrifying. Time seemed to stop as the tension between them reached a breaking point. In a blur of movement, the girl rushed toward him and he sprang to his feet with a force that belied his injuries. The chains rattled as he leapt across the room, smashing through the window with a deafening crash. I flinched as the icy wind and snowstorm flooded the room, forcing us to shield ourselves. Glass shards scattered across the floor. For a moment, all we could do was stare at the shattered window, stunned by what we'd just witnessed, but it wasn't over. The man Mark had been attempting to arrest suddenly lunged, grabbing the officer's pistol in a swift, practiced move. In one fluid motion, he shoved Mark to the ground and leapt through the same broken window, disappearing into the storm. "Damn it!" Mark shouted, scrambling to his feet. Without a moment's hesitation, he grabbed the abandoned rifle and dove out the window after them. We stood frozen, the freezing wind swirling around us, the sounds of the storm echoing in the shattered glass. Mary clung to Henry, sobbing softly, while John stood motionless, his face pale and drawn. My mind raced. Who were these people? What was happening here? This house, this night, it was a trap. A web of horrors that seemed to tighten with every passing second. Part of me wanted to run, to leave everything behind. But where would we go? The blizzard outside was relentless, and something far worse seemed to be lurking in the dark. We retreated from the living room, closing the door to block the wind and snow. The house was eerily quiet now, but the tension was suffocating. We waited in heavy silence until, minutes later, the front door burst open. Mark stumbled inside, dragging the man who had fled. The officer's face was grim. A bloody scratch streaked across his cheek. The man looked exhausted but defiant. "To the kitchen!" Mark barked, shoving him forward. We followed them silently. Mark forced the man to sit on the floor near the old radiator and cuffed him to the metal pipes, making escape impossible. It was crude, but it worked. "All right," Mark said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Start talking. Who are you, and what the hell is going on here?" The man hesitated, then exhaled a long, weary sigh. He leaned back against the wall, his sharp eyes scanning each of us in turn. "Quite a lot of guests for my house," he said with a bitter smirk. Mark stepped closer, pistol in hand. "Talk, now." The man's smirk faded, replaced by a grim expression. "My name's David," he began. "I've lived in this house for 10 years. I used to have a family, a wife and a son. We loved it here, the peace, the nature. But then they came. Monsters. They killed my family." His voice cracked, his gaze burning with a mixture of anger and grief. "Since then, I've been hunting them, trying to stop them. That's the only reason I'm still here." Mark frowned. "What monsters? Are you talking about the ones who ran off?" David let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "You think they're victims? Those things will rip you apart without a second thought. By freeing him, you've made us all targets. They'll be back. And soon." David glanced at the old clock on the wall. 10 minutes left," he said, his voice eerily calm. We followed his gaze. It was nearly midnight. "What happens at midnight?" John asked, his voice trembling. David grinned darkly. "They're not human. They're werewolves, or something like them. At midnight, they change. Once they do, killing them becomes a whole lot harder." "Werewolves?" I asked, a chill running down my spine. "All this time," David continued, "they've been preying on people. Look at the forest behind the field. When their food runs low, they come out to the road. Their method's always the same. One of them throws themselves in front of a car. The driver thinks they've hit someone and stops. That's when the others attack. They drag the victims back to the forest. And then..." He trailed off, letting the silence speak for itself. The room fell into an oppressive quiet. No one wanted to believe him, but the conviction in his voice was undeniable. And deep down, in the pit of our stomachs, we were beginning to fear he was telling the truth. The kitchen was steeped in tension as Mark kept his eyes on David, his skepticism barely masking the undercurrent of unease. While Mark didn't seem convinced, something about David's composed certainty gnawed at the back of my mind. A chill crept down my spine as I glanced at the storm raging outside. Beside me, John tugged at my sleeve and gestured toward the hallway. I followed him with Jake trailing behind, and once we were out of earshot, John lowered his voice. "Look, I hate to say it, but I think he might be telling the truth," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. I opened my mouth to argue but stopped short. Everything David said sounded insane. Werewolves, transformations, attacks. But something deep within me screamed that we were in grave danger. That instinct had been clawing at me since the moment we stepped foot in this cursed house. "I feel it too," I admitted. "Everything inside me is yelling to get out of here." But I glanced toward the nearest window. The storm outside had only grown fiercer, snow swirling violently in the gale as if the wind itself were trying to batter down the walls. "We can't leave." John leaned closer. "Then we prepare. We saw the arsenal. Do you know how to use a gun?" I nodded. "Dad used to take Jake and me hunting. I know how to handle a rifle." "Good." John's voice was steady. "We're grabbing weapons and heading upstairs. There's equipment up there. Thermal scopes, telescopes. If what David says is true, we need to see them coming." Jake, though pale and clearly terrified, gave a shaky nod of agreement. We made our way to the arsenal, the room thick with an ominous energy. The weapons hung on the walls, silent sentinels waiting for their moment. John grabbed a rifle and a box of ammo. Jake chose a shotgun, and I opted for a carbine with a mounted scope. I also picked up a few knives and a handheld radio, though I wasn't sure it would work in this weather. When we returned to the kitchen, Mark eyed the weapons in our hands with a grim frown but said nothing. "We're going upstairs to scout the perimeter," I explained. Mark glanced between me and John, then gave a curt nod. On the second floor, we entered the room with the equipment. The oppressive feeling in the house hadn't lifted. If anything, it was growing heavier. John immediately went to the window and tried the telescope, but the blizzard made visibility almost non-existent. "Can't see a thing," he muttered. I picked up a thermal imaging device from the table. When I looked through it, the world outside transformed. The barren expanse of snow came into focus, swirling winds illuminated in faint shades of heat. For a moment I saw nothing unusual, just the endless storm. Then I spotted it. "Wait," I breathed, my fingers trembling as I adjusted the focus. "There's something out there." "What?" John leaned in as I passed him the thermal scope. He pressed it to his eye and his expression darkened. "Little orange dots," he whispered. "A bunch of them. Moving." I grabbed the scope again and confirmed what I'd seen. Faint heat signatures, about a dozen, emerging from the storm. They were distant, but unmistakably moving toward us. "They're coming," I said, my voice barely audible. John shot to his feet. He sprinted downstairs, his shouts echoing through the house. Moments later, Mark appeared, his face tight with tension as he ascended to join us. "What do you see?" he asked, and I handed him the thermal scope. Mark looked through the device and his jaw clenched. Damn it. The heat signatures were closer now, circling the house in an almost predatory pattern. Mark lowered the scope and glanced at the clock. We all followed his gaze. 11:59, 1 minute to midnight. And then it began. Through the scope, the heat signatures began to shift. They expanded, elongated, and contorted. Whatever these things were, they were changing, and it wasn't natural. "They're growing?" Jake whispered, his voice trembling. Mark's eyes widened as he passed the scope back to me. Without a word, he bolted downstairs. Moments later, he returned with David in tow. David took the scope, his face grim but unsurprised as he peered through it. "Told you," he said with a bitter smirk. And then, from outside, it came. A howl. Deep, guttural, and primal, it vibrated through the walls, sending a shiver down my spine. One howl became 2, then 3, until the air outside was alive with their blood-curdling cries. Mary and Henry had joined us upstairs, clutching each other in terror. Mary was quietly sobbing while Henry's knuckles were white as he gripped her hand. David's voice cut through the tension. "We need to arm up. Everyone to this floor. This is the easiest place to defend." We moved with purpose. Jake, John, and I dashed downstairs, gathering as much ammunition, firearms, and makeshift weapons as we could carry. By the time we returned, Mark and David were already setting up barricades, dragging furniture to block windows and positioning the thermal scope on a makeshift stand. The second floor became our fortress. Each of us took a position near a window or makeshift barrier, our weapons loaded and ready. The howls outside grew louder, closer, and more numerous, their savage intensity shaking us to our cores. My hands gripped the carbine tightly, the cold steel grounding me. I felt fear, yes, but it was laced with adrenaline. We didn't know what was coming, but we all understood one thing. This house would either protect us or become our tomb. David moved with precision, his motions calm yet deliberate, like a man who'd faced situations like this countless times before. Without a word, he disappeared briefly and returned carrying a sniper rifle equipped with a thermal scope. His determined expression made it clear he had a plan, and none of us dared question him. "I'm opening the window," he announced, already moving to do so. As the window creaked open, an icy gust of wind and snow blasted into the room, forcing us to shield our faces. David braced the rifle on the windowsill and leaned into the scope. "I see them," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the storm. The first shot rang out, sharp and deafening in the confined space. We flinched, but David didn't even blink. His breathing stayed steady, his focus unbroken. "One," he murmured. A second shot. I glanced at the scope and caught a glimpse of one of the creatures. A monstrous, deformed figure collapsing into the snow. 2. The third shot echoed through the room, followed by the sight of another figure, grotesque and misshapen, crumpling to the ground. 3. But the others had realized they'd been spotted. A guttural growl reverberated through the storm, and the crunching of snow under heavy, rapid footsteps filled the air. They were coming fast. "They're moving!" John shouted, gripping his rifle tighter. The howls outside grew louder, more feral. Then came the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. "They're inside!" Jake yelled, panic lacing his voice. We scrambled into the hallway, taking cover behind a barricade of furniture we'd hastily arranged at the top of the staircase. It felt pitifully inadequate against the creatures we were facing, but it was all we had. Heavy footsteps thudded on the floor below, accompanied by the sickening scrape of claws against wood. The sound sent shivers down my spine as we held our breath, waiting. The first shadow appeared at the bottom of the staircase, a hulking figure with glowing red eyes. Mark fired, and the creature let out a piercing screech, but didn't go down. It was enormous, far larger than we'd anticipated, its twisted form barely recognizable as anything human. We opened fire in unison, the thunder of gunshots reverberating through the house. The bullets tore into the walls, the floor, and the advancing creatures. One of them lunged up the stairs, but John's shot hit it square in the head, sending it tumbling back. Several creatures breached the barricade, their snarls and growls filling the hallway. We fought them off, each shot bringing them down only after what felt like too much effort. One reached the couch, its claws raking the fabric as I fired a shot into its chest, knocking it back with a shrill, agonized cry. Then we heard it, another crash of shattering glass. This time, it was coming from above us. We rushed to the bedroom where the noise originated. In the center of the room stood another creature, even larger than the ones we'd seen so far. Its fur bristled, its glowing eyes burned with rage, and its mouth was filled with razor-sharp teeth. It snarled, saliva dripping from its jaws as it moved with unnatural speed. Bullets flew, but the creature was too fast. It leapt from wall to wall, avoiding most of our shots. Then it lunged for Jake. I fired just in time, my bullet hitting its side and forcing it to retreat with a guttural screech. The creature scaled the walls, shredding the plaster with its claws, before leaping at us again. David's shot was perfect, straight through the head. The beast let out a final, ear-splitting wail before collapsing to the floor in a heap. We stood in stunned silence, our breaths ragged and labored, weapons still clenched in our hands. The room was in ruins, walls scarred and splattered with dark blood, and the icy wind howled through the broken window. The silence that followed the chaos was brief, almost taunting. My breath was ragged as I cautiously approached the downed creature. Up close, it was even more monstrous than I had imagined. Its massive, twisted limbs ended in long, jagged claws, and its thick, matted fur looked more like patches of scorched grass. Its elongated muzzle, with blood-red eyes now dim and lifeless, housed rows of razor-sharp teeth, still bared in a grotesque snarl. For a fleeting moment, I felt as though I had stepped into a nightmare I couldn't wake from. Reality snapped back with a sound that sent a chill down my spine, the distant rumble of an engine. I rushed to the shattered window, the freezing wind slicing at my face as I strained to see through the swirling snow. Through the storm, a car emerged, its headlights piercing the darkness for a fleeting moment before shutting off as it came to a stop near the house. Beside me, Mark reacted first, his breath a sharp exhale as he turned toward the chaos outside. He grabbed his gun, his expression set with determination. I moved to follow, but Jake's hand clamped down on my arm, his grip trembling with fear. For a moment, we locked eyes, an unspoken understanding passing between us. This was no time for hesitation. Mark bolted toward the door, his movements quick and decisive. I shook free of Jake's grasp and followed, adrenaline pushing me forward. The icy wind tore at us as we plunged into the storm, the snow biting and blinding with every step. The car loomed ahead, its interior light casting a weak glow through the frosted windows. Inside, two women sat huddled together, their faces pale and tense, their eyes darting in confusion and fear. Mark waved them toward the house with urgency, the storm swallowing any sound he might have made. Their hesitation was brief, their instincts kicking in as they scrambled to push open the car doors. Every second felt heavier than the last, the storm threatening to bury us all in its icy grip. We opened the car door and they froze for a moment, their terror only intensifying at the sight of our weapons. But when one of them noticed Mark's uniform, she seemed to calm slightly, reaching out to reassure her friend. Mark motioned for the women to move, his demeanor steady but filled with urgency. Their hesitant steps quickened as they stumbled out of the car and into the biting wind. And then it appeared, a shadowy figure materializing through the storm behind the vehicle. Its movements were uneven, jagged. like a predator stalking through the snow. As it came into view, the grotesque details emerged. A missing arm, the jagged wound still oozing dark blood that trailed in the snow like a macabre signature. A wave of nausea churned in my gut as recognition struck. It was the same creature that had escaped earlier, relentless and unforgiving in its pursuit. My instincts flared, and without a moment's hesitation, I swung my rifle up, bracing against the growing storm. The air seemed to thicken, every second stretching as the danger closed in. Mark followed suit, his pistol aimed at the advancing figure. But before either of us could fire, a single shot rang out from above. David's sniper rifle. The creature let out a final gurgling growl before collapsing into the snow. I rushed to the car, helping the women out as quickly as I could. But then a scream tore through the storm. I spun around just in time to see another creature lunging at Mark. Gunfire erupted as Mark managed to shoot it midair, but not before it raked its claws across his arm. At the same moment, something slammed into me, a searing pain tearing through my shoulder as I hit the ground hard. For a few moments, everything felt slow, surreal. The world seemed muffled except for the sound of Mark firing again and again. 2 more creatures lay dead in the snow around us. Mark grabbed my arm, hauling me to my feet. I stumbled forward, gripping my shoulder as blood soaked through my coat. Jake and John appeared at the door, pulling us inside just as another creature slammed into the barricade behind us. Then came the sound of splintering wood and shattering glass from the kitchen. Before we could react, one of the creatures leapt into the hallway. It pounced on John, slamming him into the wall. I ignoring the pain in my shoulder as I raised my rifle. Mark fired first, hitting the creature in the shoulder. It howled but didn't falter, turning its rage on Mark. He narrowly dodged its claws and shot it in the side, but it kept coming. I took a deep breath, steadied my aim despite the burning pain, and fired. The shot hit its head and the creature collapsed with a sickening thud, its claws twitching one final time. We scrambled back to the second floor, blood dripping from my wound as my vision blurred. Once there, we reinforced the barricade at the top of the stairs, dragging whatever furniture we could find to block the way. I collapsed against the wall, clutching my shoulder as the adrenaline began to fade, leaving only the searing pain and exhaustion. Around me, the others looked just as drained, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. The house fell silent again, but the howls outside continued, closer than ever. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. We barricaded ourselves on the second floor, using furniture and anything else we could find. The room had become our last line of defense. I didn't know how many creatures were left, but it didn't seem like many. However, each one was lethally dangerous. Mark and John were helping me bandage my shoulder. The pain was excruciating, like someone was ripping my skin from the inside. "Hold still," Mark said, wrapping the bandage tightly. "The most important thing is to stop the bleeding." I gritted my teeth, trying not to scream, but a sharp ringing filled my head. Meanwhile, the girls, pale and terrified, huddled in the corner of the room. Their eyes were wide with horror, as if they couldn't believe what was happening. "What is this?" one of them whispered. "What's going on here?" None of us answered. Time was too precious. We waited, each of us tense, when suddenly a terrified scream broke the silence. It was Mary. I rushed to her as Jake handed me the device. Raising it to my eyes, I froze. In the distance, a swarm of orange dots emerged, glowing like embers scattered across the frozen horizon. They shifted and swarmed, countless and relentless, a living tide rolling toward the house. It was impossible to count them all. The blizzard seemed to pulse with life, transformed into an advancing army. Lowering the device, disbelief gripped me. Beside me, David stood frozen, his usually calm demeanor cracked. His shoulders sagged slightly as if bearing the weight of what he hadn't anticipated. The sheer scale of the threat rendered any further discussion meaningless. The decision came quickly. Staying was suicide. We needed to move. Downstairs, chaos erupted as we grabbed what we could: guns, ammunition, flashlights, hands fumbling but swift, driven by adrenaline. The storm outside was merciless, an icy wall that bit at any exposed skin. Snow whipped so furiously I could barely make out the truck through the blinding white. Mark raised a hand, signaling urgently for action. The plan was clear: split into 2 vehicles, cover each other during the escape. But before the group could organize, the women bolted toward their car. The engine roared to life, its warmth already inviting, and they were gone, swallowed by the storm without hesitation. There was no time to waste. John's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding as he motioned toward the pickup. Everyone scrambled in, the truck's engine growling against the fury of the blizzard. There was no time to think, no time for second-guessing. Survival demanded we move now. We piled into his truck. Me, John, Jake, and David. Meanwhile, Mark loaded the elderly couple into his SUV. Headlights cut through the snowy darkness, and the engines roared, pulling us from the frozen grip of the storm. John took the wheel, jaw clenched, while David sat by the window, weapon ready. I sat in the back, clutching my injured shoulder but ready to fire if it came to that. We slowly rolled off the house's driveway, the headlights slicing through the storm. The pickup growled as it plowed through the snow-packed road, tires slipping but holding steady for now. Mark followed closely behind us, his headlights the only sign we weren't alone. Snow swirled around us, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere out there, hidden in the blizzard, they were already waiting for us. We sped down the snow-covered highway as fast as the weather allowed. The pickup's tires skidded at every turn, and visibility was nearly zero. The wind hurled snow against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. John gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white with tension. Mark followed behind us in his SUV, his headlights occasionally flickering in the rearview mirror. We tried to push forward, but the road was too slick to risk going any faster. Suddenly, Mark's headlights flashed repeatedly and then stopped. "What's going on?" Jake asked anxiously. "He stopped," I said, pointing behind us. "Looks like he found something." John slammed the brakes and we turned around. As we got closer, I saw Mark standing next to the girl's car. Its front end was crushed, the vehicle half buried in a snowdrift, wheels sunk deep into the snow. "Damn," I muttered under my breath. We climbed out of the truck, the icy wind slapping us in the face. Struggling through the snow, I made my way to the wreck. Mark was examining it, his expression grim. "There's blood," he said, gesturing to the shattered windshield. They didn't make it. Inside the car, signs of a struggle were evident. The upholstery was torn, blood smeared the steering wheel and doors. It was clear the girls had tried to escape, but didn't stand a chance. "We're wasting time," David said, scanning the surroundings. "They're here." That's when the creature lunged out of the darkness. It struck Mark, knocking him to the ground. Its guttural roar shattered the silence, claws tearing into the snow, its glowing red eyes fixed on us. We opened fire. Bullets ripped through its body, but it didn't stop. John aimed his shotgun and hit it in the side, but the beast turned sharply and leapt at him. He went down hard, slamming into the car and dropping his weapon. I raised the carbine, took aim, and fired. The shot hit true, the creature letting out a bone-chilling shriek before collapsing onto its side. It twitched once, then went still, its form quickly disappearing under the relentless snowfall. Jake's voice broke through the storm as he sprinted toward John, who was slumped against the snowbank. John's arm dangled uselessly, blood seeping through his coat and staining the icy ground. His face was pale, his breaths shallow, but his voice came out in a strained groan. "I'm fine," he muttered, though his body betrayed him. "I just can't drive anymore." There was no time to argue. We helped him into the pickup, his weight heavy against us as we maneuvered him into the cab. Jake slid into the driver's seat, his hands gripping the wheel, trembling slightly but determined. He took a quick look around the truck, his gaze lingering on each of us to ensure we were ready. Without a word, the truck roared to life and we moved forward, the tires crunching against the icy ground. The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, the snow obliterating any landmarks or sense of direction. The world outside was nothing but a featureless frozen void, and the storm howled like a living thing, pressing against the vehicle from all sides. Inside the cab, the oppressive silence was broken by the sharp beep of David's device on the dashboard. The sound snapped all of us to attention. David leaned forward, studied the screen, and for the briefest moment, the corners of his lips twitched upward in a faint smile. Then, with calm deliberation, he pressed a large button on the device. "What's that?" I asked, trying to see the screen. "A surprise," he said, his calm demeanor unshaken. A distant explosion rumbled behind us. We all turned, though the snowstorm obscured any view of the source. "The house," David explained. "I rigged it a long time ago. If we were leaving, I figured we might as well leave a parting gift." I stared silently out at the storm beyond the window. The house that had been our trap had now become a barrier against the creatures. We drove on, leaving the nightmare behind us. No one spoke, each lost in their own thoughts. The blizzard began to ease and the horizon came into view. For the first time, it felt like the frozen hell was finally behind us. We raced forward, hoping that beyond the snowy wasteland, salvation awaited.